Thin Wood Walls, Chapter 7. March wound down like a tired clock. I felt like a prisoner waiting to make his final request. I had one. Make Pearl Harbor just a bad dream. I could outlast a bad dream. One drizzly afternoon I took a walk. I found myself at Mr. Spooner's place. In any other spring, I would not have been out there in the dirt with my family, working and planting. Not this spring. Our 20 acres lay untouched. I saw Mr. Spooner 100 yards away, riding his tractor over his own section, plowing furrows in the black earth. He was alone. Looking up, he saw me and climbed down. He walked to the road and shook my hand, not letting go. He pushed back his wet cowboy hat, and the wrinkles around his eyes came out of the shadows. He looked tired. "How you doing, Joe?" he said. "Fine," I lied. "Where are your field hands, Mr. Spooner?" He let go of my hand, waved out at the empty land. I had some for a few days, working hard, hoping. Then the relocation thing came out, and they thought, why bother? "Sorry," I said. "I'm sorry, Joe. How's your mom?" "Strong," I said, "but she worries." "No word on when you might see your dad?" I shook my head. "Remind her I'm here to help. If she's too proud, you come yourself." "I will," I said. But I wouldn't. Pride didn't stop with my mom. Mr. Spooner shook my hand again. I watched him march back to his tractor and fire it up and begin plowing. I imagined Dad at the wheel of that tractor. I tried to imagine him where he was now. I thought about Mom, trying so hard to fill the empty space he had left behind. My heart ached at the same time it was swelling with pride. I walked on. The fields should have been filled with people and activity. They were deserted. What was the point of planting? Who would care for the crops? Who would harvest? Young men were going to war. Young women were going to Seattle to make bombers for Boeing. And Japanese American workers and tenant farmers? We were just going away. The abandoned farms were proof of that, even though part of me still didn't want to believe it. A few days later, the government found another way to make Japanese Americans feel like the enemy. We were put under curfew, which meant we had to be off the streets between 8 at night and 6 in the morning. And travel restrictions. We could travel only 5 miles from our houses. Curfew was hard. The first night I stood in my yard as white people walked or drove past. Then I went to my room and lay on my bed. I stared down at my old rag rug and imagined sitting on it, floating out my window, high above the yard and the streets and the little people with their pale faces and pointy fingers. They reach up, trying to grab me, but I laugh and zoom away. Having to stay closer to home wasn't as tough. Long walks weren't much fun anymore. I was tired of ugly looks and sharp words, worried about something worse. If I wanted to go to Ray's, he came over and walked me back and forth. If I wanted to go anywhere else, Mike invited himself along. Mom made sure of it. He told her of our problem with Mueller and Friend. But one afternoon, Ray and I decided to walk to town after school. It was the middle of May and warm, and I was tired of the leash around my neck. As we neared the business area, I noticed 2 soldiers nailing a piece of paper to a telephone pole. We stopped and watched. They nailed another one below it. They stepped back and admired their work, and then moved on to a pole down the street. "What are they doing?" Ray said. "I don't know, but my breath caught in my chest." A small crowd of white people was gathering around the soldiers, watching them tack up another poster. One man started clapping and cheering. He turned toward us, smiling. It was Mr. Langley. "Shut up, Langley," a man's voice said from the back of the crowd. A familiar voice. The man pushed through to Mr. Langley and stared bullets at him. It was Mr. Davis, our school principal. "Go peddle your hate somewhere else." They stood, facing each other, as voices rose. People took sides. Then the soldiers moved in, splitting up the crowd, herding them away. "Okay, folks," one said, "let's break this up. Let's move along." "What's done is done," the other one said. "No sense making it worse." People walked away, humming like bees. Some stayed to read the notices. Mr. Davis's wife took him by the elbow and led him off. Mr. Langley hung around, sharing a nasty laugh with his younger son, Harold. Across the street, the policemen were tapping other flyers onto the barbershop window. I hurried to the closest pole. Ray came up next to me, and we stood side by side and studied the posters. "Notice," one said in big letters. "Headquarters. Western Defense Command and 4th Army, it said under that. Farther down was the date, when the words Civilian Exclusion Order number 79. More words in smaller letters followed, but I skipped to the other paper. It was also from the Western Defense Command and 4th Army. Instructions to all persons of Japanese ancestry, it said. The word Japanese was 3 times as big as the others, just in case we might have missed it. Or maybe they believed if we couldn't read English, we would read Big English. I thought I was ready for this. I've heard of other Japanese Americans already being taken away. Bainbridge Island and Seattle, and just to the north of us in Kent and Renton. But I wasn't ready. A fog settled over me, wet, chilling. I breathed it in, and it numbed my throat when Ray asked me a question I couldn't answer. I just kept staring at the words. Words that told of a civil control station, set up at the Auburn High School gym, where a responsible member of our family, preferably the head of the family, had to report within 2 days for registration and instruction. Words that spoke of what the government would do to assist us in the evacuation. Words that told us what we could take with us to our destinations, an assembly center somewhere. The list of what we could take was long: bedding and linens, toilet articles, extra clothing, essential personal items. But under the list was a warning that we could take only what we could carry. I pictured Grandmother struggling with her belongings. At the bottom of the instructions was the name of the Army guy in charge of sending us away, Lieutenant General J.L. DeWitt. I read the instructions again while Ray waited. I would have to go home and tell Mom and Mike, the grandmother, about this. The government people wanted the head of our family to report to the civil control station, but they'd already stolen away the head of our family. Now they were going to do the same to us. My knees weakened from standing still too long. From the warmth, and Ray grabbed my arm and held on, keeping me on my feet. "Sorry, Joe," he said. "Let's walk." We turned and took a few steps and almost stumbled into Mr. Langley and Harold. We stopped. They stopped. Harold eyed us, shaking his head sadly. "It's too bad," he said, looking at Ray. "Yeah," Ray said. "It's too bad you're only Jap on the inside, O'Brien, or we could send you off to summer camp with your little yellow buddy." His sad face broke into a wide grin. Ray charged him, but Mr. Langley stepped between them and held on to Ray. "Let him come, Dad," Harold said, dancing around like a boxer. I would have loved to see him knocked on his back, but Ray would have been overmatched, even with anger on his side. "You don't want to get your hands dirty, son," Mr. Langley said. "Head on home." Harold quit dancing and moved on down the street. Mr. Langley let Ray struggle loose, then turned and started after Harold. 10 feet away, he looked back at me. "Pack your bags, son," he said. He grinned a muddy grin and continued on. "Morons," Ray said, trying to catch his breath. He walked me home, then came in while I told my family. They seemed to take it better than I had. Maybe they'd already buried their last hope. Mom and Mike and Mr. and Mrs. Fujinaga walked back to town to see for themselves, while Ray headed for home, and I sat with Tommy Fujinaga and Grandmother. "An adventure for you, Joseph," she said. "Something to write about." I would rather write nothing. "This is your choice," she said, "but this wave will wash over us, whether or not you choose to describe it, to record your feelings." I knew Grandmother was right, but something in me refused to admit it. I shrugged. The job of being the responsible person in the family once again fell on Mom's shoulders. Grandmother was too old and cranky, Mike was too young and cranky, and I was just too young. And we'd all gotten more comfortable with Mom stepping in for Dad. So she went to Mike's school the next day and got instructions and tags for us and our stuff. In practically no time, we were registered, numbered, and ready for shipment. As if we were cattle. All I needed was a brand on my behind. They gave Mom our departure date, May 22nd, a Friday, which meant we had 5 days to sell or store our belongings. The notice said the government would take care of some storage, but we had no reason to trust the government. We didn't know where we were going, but Mom learned it would be an assembly center, then a relocation camp. We knew that Japanese Americans from Seattle and other cities in Washington had gone to an assembly center in the Puyallup Fairgrounds. The government had named it Camp Harmony. Ha! The O'Briens offered to store Mom's good dishes and our artwork, photos, and radio, and bought other things from us at a fair price. but the rest of the stuff we couldn't take was at the mercy of the scavengers who came to Japanese-American homes looking for bargains, offering 10 cents on the dollar, knowing we had little choice. Mom sold our Ford to a man for $20, our beds to another man for $3 each. A man came to our yard and spent a long time eyeing the chest of drawers Mike had spent so many hours crafting. Finally, he offered Mike $1. Mike waited for the man to smile at his unfunny little joke. I smiled. Then I didn't. The man wasn't joking. $1, I said. Mike didn't say anything. He took a hammer from Dad's toolbox and smashed the chest to splinters. For a moment I stopped breathing. Seeing it destroyed tore away another piece of my life, but seeing Mike's pride in doing it brought chills to my spine. "What will you give me for it now?" Mike said. The man walked away, shaking his head. "Vermin," Grandmother said. There were many school days when the hands on the clock seemed frozen, when I couldn't wait to get out of my desk. But my last day of school went way too fast. I looked around the classroom in the morning, imagining it half empty the following day, and the next thing I knew, it was time to go. Mrs. Linden had been quiet. Whenever she began talking, her voice would get husky and she would stop and wipe at her eyes. "Choose something from your readers," she would say, "or you may draw quietly." No one gave me an ugly picture with my name on it. "Line up, young citizens," Mrs. Linden said now. We lined up, white and brown together. While she stood at the door, as we filed out, she stopped each of us who wouldn't return the next day and gave us a long hug. "Take care, Joseph," she said when it was my turn. Up close, she smelled like flowers. Her face was wet. She let go, and I was out the door. I didn't look back. On the day we were to leave, Mike and I returned to the river. We lingered there, tossing a fir cone back and forth. Spring runoff had filled the riverbanks to their high water marks. Seedling firs sprouted bright green needles. I touched them, breathing in their scent, locking it away in my memory. When we got home, we went to our room and started packing. I saw Mike jam his journal in his duffel bag, but I had something for my journal. Too much. A whole lifetime of memories. I had little time to write, though. Mom called us downstairs to help. She and Grandmother were boxing things up for the O'Briens, covering the furniture with sheets. The radio played a familiar song. I had seen Mom and Dad dance to it when they thought I was elsewhere. She listened for a minute, then unplugged the radio and covered it with a tattered towel. No one talked. We stacked boxes in a corner. We could take only what we could carry in our arms and on our backs. We would not be taking much. Choosing had been hard for Mom. Not so hard for me. I returned to my room and finished packing everything. Clothes, comic books, marbles, except my journal. That I would carry. With my duffel at my feet, I sat one last time at my window and wrote, "Mom pulls the plug on Glenn Miller's Sweet Moonlight Song. Echoes haunt the room." Ray came over. He helped carry our bags to the front yard where we sat where Mom and Mike and Grandmother did last-minute things inside. I wanted to be outside, where the air was fresh, where there were no walls. I wanted to experience open spaces for as long as I could. "I've learned where they're sending us," I said to Ray. He gave me a look, worried but not trying not to show it, curious but afraid to ask. "California," I said, "a place called Pinedale." When Mom had told us the name, I thought of log cabins, a lake, trees along its shores. "Sounds okay, Joe," Ray said. His face said otherwise. "Kind of far away, though. I was hoping for somewhere closer. You know, a place we could visit." "Yeah," I said. 1,000 miles is kind of far. Edge of the earth far. I thought we'd end up at Camp Harmony first. Mom has a friend there." Ray shook his head. "What a name. I'm surprised they didn't send you to Camp Co-operation." He stretched out the word like one of those long, skinny balloons that circus clowns twist into shapes. Hats, animals, dive bombers. I looked up at the sky. The Post-Intelligencer says, "Sensible Japanese should be cheerful about this, that it's our patriotic duty." "Start smiling," Ray said. "They sleep in horse stalls at Camp Harmony," I said. "There are fences, barbed wire." I took a deep breath and held it. Maybe if I didn't breathe, time would stop. I squeezed my eyes shut. Maybe if I closed my eyes, this would go away. Neither one worked. At 2:30, Mr. and Mrs. O'Brien drove up in their big Buick. Mrs. O'Brien and Henry went to the house to get my family. Trying to be cheerful, I helped Mr. O'Brien and Ray load duffels and boxes and Mom's and Grandmother's old suitcases. Everything we had fit with room to spare. We had packed our whole lives in the trunk of a Buick. "Why don't you check on your mom, Ray?" Mr. O'Brien said. Ray didn't answer. He just climbed up the steps and went in. When he returned, his mom and brother were with him. Behind them came Grandmother, then Mike, then Mom, taking one last look, making sure everything was put away, turned off, locked up, as if it mattered. We crowded into the car, kids in the back, adults in the front. Luckily, Mom and Grandmother were as slender as the pickets of our fence. The back seat didn't bother me this time. I didn't want to see where we were going. I didn't want to get there first. Mr. O'Brien started the car, but we sat there for a long moment. He was giving us a chance to take a last look. I rolled down my window for air and stared at the house. Its windows looked dull and empty, like the eyes of a dying trout. On the other end of the seat, Mike leaned forward and looked, then slumped back. Next to him, Henry colored in a coloring book. Next to me, Ray reached in the pocket of his jeans and pulled out a small cloth sack. Before I forget, he handed it to me, and I knew what it was by its feel. I loosened the drawstring as Mr. O'Brien pulled away, and I snuck one more look back. For what? Dad's familiar smile? I swallowed the lump in my throat. I turned the sack upside down and emptied its contents into my palm. Marbles. 6 brand new cat's eyes, all different but all colorful and wide-eyed, and smooth as butter. Thanks, Ray. I returned them to the sack and handed it to Mike. The red one's a little heavier than the rest, Ray said. A good shooter. Mike opened the sack and examined the marbles one by one. Nice, he said. The red one does have some weight. He gave them to me and I slipped the sack into the pocket of my jeans. The conversation stopped. Front seat, back seat. Outside, it had started to rain. Big spring raindrops ticked against the roof as we moved slowly down the road, joining other cars in a sad caravan. Hundreds of our neighbors leaving their homes behind, heading for the warehouse in Auburn where a train would be waiting. I opened my journal, took a pencil from my jacket pocket, and began writing. Words came. More were forming in my head. But Ray was sneaking glances, and I felt myself getting carsick. I sat back and joined in the silence. The loading dock outside the warehouse was crowded with people and luggage. 2 great mounds of it. We added ours, wondering if there would be enough room for all of it in the 2 baggage cars. It fit easily. I saw many familiar faces, Japanese and non-Japanese. The Hoshida, Nagasawa, and Yano families stood together, waiting to board the train. Mrs. Linden was there, dabbing at her red eyes with the sleeve of her dress. There were kids from school and church with their parents and grandparents. Half of me was glad to see everyone. Half of me was sad. While Mom and Grandmother were moving from group to group, while others were coming up to them and talking, while Ray was saying goodbye to other friends, I sat on a wooden vegetable box and took out my journal and continued writing. It stopped raining, but the platform was wet and the air was chilly. It was time to leave. As I stood, I felt a big hand on my shoulder, Mr. Spooner's hand. He had his cowboy hat pulled low. We shook hands, while Mrs. Spooner clasped her fingers under her chin as if she were praying. She was dressed in her best church clothes. She smiled. Her heart wasn't in it. We said our goodbyes to the rest of your family, but it was a little harder to track you down, Mr. Spooner said. You take it easy, Joe, Mrs. Spooner said. I will. We expect to see you back on the farm soon, Joe, Mr. Spooner said. It won't be the same without you, Mrs. Spooner said. I couldn't answer. My heart tugged at my throat. Mr. Spooner let go of my hand, and Mrs. Spooner took it in both of hers. Godspeed, she said. I found my family and the O'Briens. Mrs. O'Brien hugged all of us, saving an extra long, extra tight one for me. Mr. O'Brien wrapped his arms around Mom and Grandmother at the same time, dwarfing them, then shook hands with Mike and me. Henry clung to my leg as I said goodbye to Ray. I started to shake hands with him, but he got me in a bone crusher, lifting me off the ground, with Henry still attached. Can we keep him? Henry said. Can we keep Joe? Mrs. O'Brien smiled, teary-eyed. That would be wonderful for us, Henry, she said, but his family would miss him so, and I would miss my family. but the government wouldn't have let me stay behind anyway. I patted Henry on his bristly, crew-cut head. "Write me sometime," Ray said, reaching into his coat pocket. He took out 2 Hershey bars, in case you and Mike get hungry. I pocketed them in my jacket and said thanks while he pried Henry from my leg. We turned and walked to the train. Ahead of us, a soldier tried to help Grandmother up the steps. She pulled her arm away and gave him a frosty look and stepped straight back onto the train. I followed her, trying to keep my head up. My first train trip, but I wasn't excited. I was sick. We found seats, Mom and Grandmother facing backward, Mike and I facing forward. Now I wanted to see where I was going. We looked out the window. Many families were dragging out their goodbyes. The O'Briens were just outside the window of our railroad car, talking to one another, glancing up at us, saying farewells to other Japanese-American families. It felt good to see all the non-Japanese people. I had spent the last months imagining that some of them had turned against us. As if reading my thoughts, Mike spoke up. "Look at all the white people who came to make sure we leave." "Michael," Mom said. She gave him one of her darkest frowns. I handed him a Hershey bar to keep his mouth busy. "From Ray," I said. "One of those white people." He took the candy bar and held it up to the window. He gave Ray a thumbs up, then opened the wrapper and took a big bite. "My favorite," he mumbled. "How did he know?" "He's your friend," I said. Mike offered some to Grandmother, who shook her head. "Sugars," she said, and pointed to her shining white teeth. She was proud of the way they looked. Mom also said no, and I was tempted to eat mine while everyone was turning down offers to share, but I decided to wait. And while I waited, I had more to write. I wanted to write while home and the leaving were fresh in my mind. The train stands chuffing, awaiting its sad stragglers. All aboard, pilgrims. A soldier approached, stone-faced. Around his arm was a band of black cloth with the white letters MP. At his waist was a holstered pistol, dull gray, all business. Not the kind of silver, white-handled pistols Ray and I had worn while playing cowboys. He looked us over as if we were about to take out our radios and send signals to the Japanese Navy, or steal some valuables, or escape. He gawked too long at Grandmother, and I was afraid she was going to say something, but she just stared through him, as if he were a dirty window. Another soldier came by. He glanced at my journal, and I thought he was going to tell me journals weren't allowed. But he smiled and nodded and moved on. Head down, his eyes sad. He didn't want to be here either. Finally, the chuffing got louder. I heard the sound of steam escaping. The squeal of metal against metal. With a small jerk, the train moved forward. It picked up speed, and I looked outside. The O'Briens were walking along with the train, smiling up at us, wet-eyed. Henry was waving. Around them were other faces, some trying to smile, some trying to keep from crying, some teary. All were white. I waved one last time to Ray and his family as they ran out of the room, as the train gathered momentum and its whistle blasted a long, unhappy warning. It was raining again. It kept raining as the train got out into open country, farmland, and meadow and forest.